So now I want to just turn to a slightly different topic for a while. I want to talk about social organization in dogs, because this is an area that, which again gives rise to problems within our relationships. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about dominance and dispel some of the common myths and misunderstandings about dominance. The word dominance has got quite a bad name in recent years, indeed to the point where some people have said, well, we shouldn't talk about dominance, it doesn't exist in dogs. Unfortunately, that is not a very helpful way forward. Dominance exists in so much as we can observe it. Whether or not it means anything to dogs is a very different situation. And so what I want to do over the next few slides is explain exactly what dominance is and isn't. But in order to do that, I need to first of all introduce you to how dogs form their social groups, so that you can understand the role that dominance does and does not play in their social organization. And we'll revisit dominance after we've looked at more depth at the whole issue of social groups in dogs. But first of all, we need to appreciate that our minds are very different to the minds of dogs, and dominance plays a very different role in our lives as a result. Both human and dogs share a common environment. We share the home and we share common problems as a result. We want to function within the home very well, and we generally solve those functions, but we have very different minds and we solve them in very different ways. Humans try to rationalize in order to problem solve. That involves abstract thinking. Dogs look at the relationships, they try to go for the immediate solutions using their memory and factors like this. They do not rationalize like humans do. Indeed, if you look at the evolution of humans, there are a number of special features of the modern human mind, which are relatively recent developments that we would not expect to see in species like cats and dogs or horses. For example, it is thought that perhaps only in the last 100,000 years have humans been able to think abstractly. This means being able to rationalize things and make associations, do things like mathematics in our heads, etc. That ability to think abstractly, to make associations between different types of information which perhaps do not naturally go together, has been very important to our development as problem solvers. It also means we've developed a concept of time, and we can mentally time travel. We can think about what is happening now. We can also think about what has happened in the past. We can reflect on what has happened in the past and how we might change it if we encounter situations if we encountered similar situations again in the future. We can also think about the future and think about what we want to do and what might happen. So the sorts of anxieties we have might not be based on the here and now, they might be based on things that are a long way away in time. So for example, if you've got an exam in a few months' time, you could be worrying about it now, because we can transport ourselves in time. There are no cues in the current environment to indicate about the exams. And so if you were a dog, you wouldn't worry about it. You'd be more worried about the things you can observe here and now. Another important development has occurred even more recently, and that is in the last 30,000 years. That during that time, humans have started to focus much more on power and resource accumulation as a way of potentially controlling others. This is associated with an ability to undertake abstract thought. If I control the resources, then you will be dependent upon me, and we can plan accordingly. Now, that may be very important to humans, but that ability to think in that particular way is a unique human ability. It does not occur in dogs. Now, one of the things that we notice is that as these abilities evolved in humans, then humans could start to plan for the future. So they wouldn't just hunt on what was immediately available, they might be able to detect changes in the season and adapt their hunting accordingly. By contrast, a dog will take advantage of the opportunities that are there. Whereas in humans, we start to see changes in the weapons that they use at different times of year, the hunting strategies, storing of food, and factors like this, abilities that we don't see in dogs. That said, obviously some animals do cache food over winter, but they do it using very different rules to the rules that humans use. Whereas human might rationalize, there's winter coming, I need to put things away in order to see me through the cold months. Animals that cache respond to simple cues like changes in temperature or changes in sunlight, and that creates a bias in their behavior to start caching the food, which they can return to later. As far as we can tell, there's no real planning over the event. It's just a shift in the sort of behavior that they do from one moment to the next. These are very different. The reason for saying this is, as I say, as humans, we tend to think about the reasons and tend to rationalize what is going on. We have to appreciate that dogs simply don't do this. They don't have these abilities. Now, that doesn't mean that their behavior necessarily is very different. As I've mentioned, different species cache food, but they do it with different underlying cognitive processes. One of the problems that can happen is that when people see dogs behaving in ways that in a human would involve a lot of thought, they attribute the same thoughts to their animal. A common example of this is when they say, he should know better, he's clearly doing this in order to annoy me or to spite me. I don't believe that dogs have that ability, because that involves abstract thought at a level not capable of within dogs. So much of what we see in dogs is what actually emerges from simpler rules. The important thing to appreciate here is when we think about social organization, the way that we organize ourselves can be based on very simple rules or could be very carefully thought through. And I just want to draw on some work that was done in Italy looking at free-ranging dogs. But in order to do that, we need to appreciate what social organization is. Social organization is the pattern of relationships between and among individuals and groups. And those relationships are defined by the roles and division of labor or behavior required for effective and efficient operation within the social group. Now, within a human group, we might actually carefully plan who does what, whereas in other species, there will be much simpler rules that are followed, and whoever seems to be best at a job may end up leading in that particular capacity. One of the important things about carnivores, including canids, and that means dogs and wolves, is that they are very variable and flexible in the way they organize themselves. And this might explain, at least in part, their success. They're very adaptable. They can vary their social organization with the environment on the basis of the terrain, but also on the availability of resources, the ecology of the environment as well. And we'll now consider a number of populations of dogs in Italy. This is a picture of the Abruzzo region in Italy. You can see that it's a mountainous region, and there are a number of small villages. These villages literally consist of just a few hundred people in some cases. There is some local farming of livestock, particularly sheep in the area, and also a small amount of dairy. And one of the interesting things about this region is that there are many free-roaming dogs. There are some dogs that live in the village, and there are some that live outside. Some in the village are kept as pets. And I'm not going to talk about those dogs. I'm going to talk about the free-ranging ones that seem to be more sort of feature generally in the community. There are also wolves in this region as well, and I'll touch on them towards the end. So we have these groups of dogs that are free roaming in the villages. They're not owned by anybody in particular, and the dogs tend to scavenge in order to survive. So resources are not particularly limited. But in the case of the dogs that live within the village, the food is not that reliable. It depends when somebody puts their rubbish out or goes to the dump to dispose of waste. The dogs in the hills, by contrast, what's known as the sylvatic dogs or woodland dogs, they have a fairly rich food supply in the form of a large dump. This is where the waste is taken from the village and dumped. So they do have a rich food patch, but it's a single patch of food in that situation. But in both situations, the dogs are not starving. There's available resources. This makes it a particularly interesting model for understanding domestic dogs in the home. As I said, many people study wolves and then make analogies from wolves to dogs. I think it's far more useful if you want to understand dogs if you go and study dogs. And by studying dogs where resources are not that limited, we perhaps have a better insight into the behavioral tendencies of the dogs in a home environment and what might be perhaps the more natural equivalent. So the dogs in both the villages and the hills look quite similar. They're a Maremmo type, sort of 20 to 30 kilos, sheep guarding type dog. And it's perhaps worth pointing out that there has been selection against these dogs predating livestock. If they were to predate livestock, then that might trigger somebody going out to hunt and kill some of the dogs. So they're not truly feral dogs in that situation. But they do live amongst other wildlife, and we'll talk about that later on. In this particular study, they've been studied in spring, this is a time also when resources are relatively rich, and the population is quite stable in this time. Again, I think that's quite a good model of what might be going on in a domestic situation. Other studies have been done on this population by Brantani and colleagues at other times of year where the population has been less stable. And when it is less stable, then actually you see much more change in group membership. But, you know, the average home has a relatively stable population. So I'd rather focus on that particular time. In this slide, we can see two of the villages, Rovere and Sant'Iona. Rovere has 3 populations of dogs, and Sant'Iona also has 3 populations of dogs. But and in both situations, there are 10 dogs. However, they organize themselves slightly differently. Now, the important thing to appreciate here is what the researchers did is they simply observed the behavior of dogs. They do not predefine them as belonging to a particular pack or area. What they did is they watched the dogs and saw the areas that they covered. And what they found was that the dogs tend to naturally occupy particular areas, and they tended to occupy those areas with a certain number of other dogs. So within the map of Rovere, you will see there is an orange shape, a green shape, and a yellow shape. And I've pulled those shapes out so you can see them outside of the village first. But if you look carefully, you should then see those shapes represented within the village. So within the yellow shape, there were 5 dogs. So the yellow territory was occupied by 5 dogs, and all 5 dogs tended to cover the same sort of area. The green territory was occupied by 2 dogs. 2 dogs tended to limit themselves to that particular region in the centre of the 3 territories. And to the left, 3 dogs occupied the area that is bounded in orange. On the map, you'll see a number of orange dots. This is where aggressive encounters occurred. If you look carefully, you'll also see a number of blue triangles. This is where people tend to leave their waste. So these are relatively rich resource areas for the dogs. If you look, you will see that the orange dots and the blue triangles are often closely associated, i.e., the aggressive behaviour tends to occur around resources. Not exclusively the case, but it tends to be around important food resources and on the periphery of the territory. And the significance of this will become clear later on. If we turn our attention now to Santayona, the second village here, again, it became apparent there were 3 populations of dogs, divided into 2 populations of 3 and 1 of 4. And they are arranged as shown in the bottom picture. There is more overlap in this situation, but the dogs tend to restrict themselves and they organize themselves into these groups. What is interesting is when you look at the social interactions between these groups of dogs and within these groups of dogs, you see very clear patterns that are consistent across the villages. This table represents a matrix of the different dogs that make up the Revere population. So each row represents a different dog, A to J. Each column represents the same dog. That only goes up to I simply because there's no point including J because J can't form a relationship with itself. So if we go down a column and across a row, we can look at the types of interactions that occurred between those 2 individuals. So obviously a dog doesn't have relationships with itself, so the AA cell is empty, as is the BBCC. But if we go down column A and across column B, we can see that there's a green square. This indicates that the interactions between A and B are entirely friendly, whereas between A and D, the interactions are hostile, barking, growling, etc. And that's indicated with the red square. If you look at the various cells, one of the things that will strike you is that the relationships or the interactions tend to be exclusively green or red. There are a few exceptions. So for example, if you go down column A and across column J, you will see there are both red and green. This indicates that A and J sometimes are friendly to each other, sometimes they're more hostile. Likewise, if we go down F and across I, we can see the same situation. I should also point out here that the lowercase f next to the capital letters indicate that these are female individuals. Now, if you recall, there were 3 populations of Revere dogs, but there are only 2 females. So this means that some of the populations are exclusively male dogs. So these dogs did not need a female within their group to exist in a stable pack-like structure. Now that doesn't mean that they would stay like that when one of the bitches come into season, but when things are stable, they can quite happily exist in that situation. A pack doesn't need a male and a female. Now, if we look at how the dogs arrange themselves geographically, we can put circles around the different groups or squares. And that is what you can see now on the slides. So A, B, C form one group. and you can see that within that group, the interactions are exclusively friendly. D and E form the group of two, and again, their interactions are exclusively friendly. In the group F, G, H, and I, their interactions are almost exclusively friendly, although, as I pointed out earlier, the relationship between F and I sometimes seems to be a little bit hostile. So the important thing here is that within a group, dogs use a lot of friendly, amicable gestures. Aggression seems to be largely reserved for individuals outside of their social group. That's really important to appreciate because it shows that actually, aggression within a good social group is very uncommon. So we should not be using training techniques that depend on or advocate the use of aggression with the dog. Unfortunately, there are a number of popular both TV programs and books and other resources where people tend to promote this as this is how the relationship is within dogs. That's based on a misunderstanding of early wolf studies on wolves in a captivity where they were highly stressed and aggression was much more common as a result. The other thing to note on this slide is the actual number of friendly or amicable interactions compared to the number of hostile. Indeed, it's a ratio of about 30-1. So not only do we not see agonistic or aggressive interactions within a group, but when it does occur, it is very rare, and it is almost exclusively directed towards out-group members. So the basis of a social group for dogs is very much about showing friendship and not about hostility. Now, just to reiterate the point, this is the second village that was studied. And we can outline the groups and we see a very similar pattern. Indeed, in this situation, the groups there is no hostile behaviour shown amongst members of the same social group. There is perhaps more amicable behaviour shown towards out-group members, but that is also where the hostile behaviour occurs. In this case, the ratio is closer to 40-1, i.e. for every one hostile gesture, which does not mean a fight, it could be something as simple as a growl or a bark, there are 40 friendly gestures shown. This could be things like mutual licking and behaviours like this. So clearly, dogs' social organisation is based on friendships, and that is what is at the heart of these relationships. Another interesting observation was that although the dogs tended to occupy the same, a common geographic area in a group of 2 or 3, they would often go around on their own. They would only tend to form groups when perhaps they needed some form of defence. So there were no obvious packs in that situation. Bear in mind, this is a situation where the dogs are free roaming and resources are generally quite abundant. So the idea of a tightly knit pack is perhaps, again, a slight misunderstanding of the situation. Dogs are quite happy to wander around on their own. However, it's worth bearing in mind that those territories are relatively small and they are within earshot. So as long as they can hear each other, then that seems to be okay. As I said, they would group together, though, for defensive purposes. If another dog tended to enter their territory, then they would group together in order to repel them. The aggressive behaviour that did occur tended to be around the fringes or the areas of the territories that overlapped, and tended to be around key resources So, for example, the dumps, or areas that didn't have very clear boundaries, so it was much more blurred, and that might be why two dogs or two groups of dogs found themselves in the same place at the same time. It makes sense to avoid aggression if you can, because even if you win a fight, you could still get injured, and that could have serious consequences. So a key thing to take from this is that hostility between groups is not necessary for defining the groups. As I said, they are based on friendship. The hostility that occurs then is directed towards outgroup members. It's not directed within groups. So aggressive behavior is not a fundamental feature of social organization in dogs. It occurs when it has to occur. It is not the basis for sorting out the social group. Let us turn our attention now to the dogs that live in the hills and the woods nearby, the sylvatic dogs. These dogs did tend to be in groups much more, but then they were also sharing this area with wolves, and that might be one of the reasons why this occurred, because there were more threats more of the time. When a bitch whelped, then she might go off on her own in that situation and break away from the group. These dogs would occasionally go into the villages in order to access the resources. And in this map, the large blue areas represent the two villages that we've just been talking about. But even when they went into the villages, they tended to avoid physical contact. So they would often do a raid, and the dogs perhaps would do a lot of barking. Now, from a dog's perspective, if you can hear that there are perhaps 7 different barks coming towards you, and you don't have to count, you can just become aware of a larger number than you're used to within your own group, then you can identify that that group is potentially larger, and you perhaps vacate the area. There's no point having a fight if you can avoid it. So large groups tend to take precedence, and barking seems to be the main way that it's done it. So not only do dogs not engage in direct aggression, indeed they don't engage in physical contact to resolve a lot of disputes. The dogs living in the mountains and the woods tended to prefer scavenging rather than hunting, even in their larger groups. And they would tend to feed where they'd rested, so they would perhaps wake up and then tend to scavenge in that area. Interestingly, the interactions that were observed between these dogs living in the mountains and woods with large prey items like deer tended to be playful rather than predatory. Why go to all the effort of chasing down a deer when you know that there's food available in large dumps nearby? Again, from a biological point of view, it just doesn't make sense. Now, that said, these dogs have been selected against hunting for livestock. So I'm not saying that that's a universal for feral dogs, and indeed other studies of free-roaming dogs in other situations do show that they will predate, obviously, the wildlife even when dumps are available. What was found was that when changes did occur in these groups, it tended to occur around the breeding season. And it was harder for individual dogs to join a group. So if you have perhaps a couple of dogs and you're thinking of getting another dog, you may be better off to get 2 dogs, make sure those 2 dogs know each other and integrate the 2 groups rather than try to just introduce a single dog to the group, which may be more problematic to an established group. So, in summary, what we see when we just observe dogs is that groups tend to naturally emerge based on the area that they cover. So if dogs tend to cover the same area, then they will tend to group together at times of need. And this is reflected in their interactions. And those interactions tend to be very friendly the vast majority of the time. This is quite different to wolves. You don't see the pack hunting in these dogs, unlike wolves, and packing tends to be associated with defense, safety in numbers, if you like. So you'll see the dogs grouping together in order to protect a food supply from competitors or to protect themselves against potential predators like wolves. The dogs also do not try to control the breeding females. In wolf packs, then there's often one male and female that may be breeding. Whereas in these dogs, what you see is that when a female comes into season, all the members of that group get an opportunity to breed with the female. And when the female has young, assuming the environment is relatively rich in resources, then the males play no role in bringing up the young. So there's no cooperative paternal care. Again, this is quite different to the situation in wolves. So this highlights the importance of studying dogs rather than wolves in order to understand their natural behavior. And as I said, I think this particular wild environment, if you like, is a good model of what may be natural for the home environment. Resources are rich, animals are in a relatively well-defined area, and they have a lot of freedom in that situation. What I haven't mentioned much at this point is dominance and leadership, because I want to emphasize the fact that the social groups are bonded together through affectionate bonds. But it's important that we address this important topic of dominance and leadership. And the first thing to appreciate is dominance and leadership are not the same. They are two different phenomena. Dominance concerns who takes precedence in a particular situation. Leadership concerns who directs the activity. An animal can be considered a leader if, when it does something, other members of the group tend to engage in that behavior. So if one dog wanders off to go hunting and the rest of the dogs follow, then that animal can be seen as a leader. So in the case of leadership, we have leaders and followers. In the case of dominance, what we have is who takes precedence in a particular situation, who goes first, if you like. And the one who gives way is subordinate in that situation. Now, neither of these are the basis of a social group. As I've said, a social group is a group that want to be together, and so it is based on strong bonds within the group. However, that doesn't mean that dominance and leadership are not an important part of social organization. But whereas in humans, we might focus on things like and discuss who is best at a particular task or doing something. In dogs, it naturally emerges. Whoever seems to be best at a task is assigned that task, and others will tend to follow in that situation. That is how leadership may well develop. So leadership and dominance emerge from the interaction. So whoever is the best hunter might lead the hunt. It emerges. It is not designated to them, and then they become the best hunter. It's a natural phenomenon. You observe that this person seems to be good at coordinating the activity, then let them coordinate. You'll be more successful if you work together and you respect that individual's leadership. In the case of dominance, then, if there can be simple rules that are followed, that if you're bigger, I'll let you go first, because otherwise we could clash and there could be a fight, and I want to avoid fights. So we can use simple rules in order to define who takes precedence in a particular situation. So when we talk about emergent phenomena, what we mean is they do not have a physical basis, but they emerge from the pattern of interactions that we observe. So scientists can observe dominant individuals and leaders, but that doesn't mean that the animals themselves recognize them as being dominant as an individual, but they recognize that in a certain situation they should give way to an individual. You'll notice at this point there is no mention of violence being necessary. These are actually features of a social group that help to prevent clashes and violence and hostility as a result. If I know that you lead, then I won't try and lead, and that won't cause any confusion. It means we can operate well as a group. Likewise, if there's a bone and we're equal distance and I see you walking towards it and I know that you're bigger than me, I will back off. And that way we won't have a fight over it. But another confusion that can happen with dominance is that actually dominance has several different definitions, even within the scientific literature. And sometimes it is associated with aggression. I'm going to turn to that topic now. So within the scientific literature, there are perhaps three forms of dominance commonly described. The first is agonistic dominance, and this is perhaps a form of dominance that is most obvious to people. If two animals have a fight, who tends to win? And that's what an agonistic dominance hierarchy is. Likewise, when scientists were studying competition and how animals take precedence, they might induce a fight in order to study it in the early days. We wouldn't do that now. But you can observe who tends to win a fight. And if you have subjects A and B, and A tends to win the fight, then you would say A is dominant to B. If there's a fight between B and C, then you would, and B tends to beat C whenever they have a fight, you would say B was dominant to C. Now, in this situation, you would assume that even if you hadn't seen it, if there was to be a fight between A and C, given that A tends to beat B and B tends to beat C, then A should be dominant to C. Unfortunately, when we look at dogs, that doesn't always happen. We can end up with triangular hierarchies. We don't end up with neat linear hierarchies. If we look at just the fights that occur, it might be that C is dominant to A. We think this is perhaps because animals if we just focus on the fights that occur, we have to think about the reasons why they're fighting. And animals may defend a particular resource for a particular reason. So just using aggression in order to measure dominance can be misleading if we're thinking about the broader social organization of the group. It doesn't result in neat social linear hierarchies in that situations. So a second way to examine dominance is to look not just at when there are fights, but when there is competition. Because as we've already noted, dogs can spend a lot of time resolving conflicts without coming to physical blows. So we might not only include the outcomes of fights, but also other situations where the animals may be competing over something and see who tends to win, whether or not there is any aggression. As with agonistic dominance, when we look at this, we tend not to see nice, neat, linear hierarchies. A could be dominant to B, B could be dominant to C, and C could be dominant to A. Indeed, if you think about a Great Dane and a Chihuahua, you might think, well, the Great Dane is so much bigger, it's bound to be dominant. But then think about it, who tends to get the best spots to sleep in? Probably the Chihuahua. So it's not all about size in that situation. So competitive ability, again, is not a good measure of social dominance in dogs. The third form of dominance that we often see is what's known as ritualized dominance. In this case, we do not necessarily have to have a resource or a fight in order to evaluate who is giving way and who is taking precedence. We look at the body language, and there seem to be a number of behaviors that tend to indicate who is going to take precedence and who is going to give way. And it's well illustrated in this picture. The dominant individual tends to stand over another individual, adopt a high posture, look at the straightness of the front legs of this dog, and may also engage in muzzle biting, i.e. holding the muzzle of the other dog. Dogs that engage in these situations, in these behaviors, will tend to be dominant. They'll tend to take precedence. By contrast, dogs that wag their tail and with their whole body moving at the same time, or tend to adopt low postures, do a lot of mouth licking, passing under the head of other dogs, or avoidance movements, other forms of avoidance movement, tend to be subordinate, and they tend to give way in general. And interestingly, when you use these measures, then actually you do get much clearer linear dominance hierarchies within dogs. So if A is dominant to B in this situation and B is dominant to C, then A is also dominant to C, or C is subordinate to A, if you prefer. So this seems to give us details of the language that dogs use in social groups in order to work out who should take precedence in a particular situation. Note, these are not aggressive actions, and dominance is not being asserted aggressively. It's about the posture and the willingness, and indeed subordinance tends to be offered up rather than dominance asserted. If you think about it, how can you be dominant if somebody just wants to fight you? You need the individuals to want to be subordinate in order to have a peaceful social group. So formal dominance provides a low-risk strategy for establishing who takes precedence. And what it requires is that there is some consistency in the interactions. Individuals have to, if you like, respect the rules. And what you allow will actually become an expectation. So if you always give way to an individual, then that individual will assume that they can take precedence in that situation. In the case of owners, if they suddenly change the rules, then that can cause problems. So, for example, if the owner is quite happy to have the dog on their bed, but then changes that rule, well, the dog has the expectation it can be on the bed. That's confusing to the dog, and it says, well, I'm usually allowed this, and now you're not allowing that situation. That can give rise to conflict. It doesn't mean the conflict is a social challenge. And this is why it's important to understand that human minds can be very power focused, but dogs are just responding to the situation. It's not that the dog suddenly wants to control the social group. It's just that the dog had an expectation that he could have the bed. And then you change the rule, and the dog is saying, I don't think I agree. And it might be that in other situations, the owner also allows the dog to take precedence. So it builds the expectation that it's, it's okay to try and resolve that situation by issuing a mild threat. And indeed, the issuing of a threat doesn't indicate that there is dominance and subordinance going on. It indicates there is a breakdown of that situation. And that's the key thing to appreciate. Aggression within a hierarchy indicates that the hierarchy is not functioning well. Dogs can make these assessments very quickly. Within a stable social group, dogs will typically know their position within the hierarchy, who they give way to and who they take precedence over, as a result of consistent interactions. That can change with time, and some dogs may look to exploit certain opportunities. When you have two unfamiliar dogs, they will often make initial assessments in order to establish who is going to take precedence. Think about it. If you're walking with your dog and you meet an unfamiliar dog and they're friendly, one of them will soon end up the instigator of the play. And dogs are perhaps unique in exactly how playful they are. So again, this all points to the fact that aggression is not the basis of dog society. So these displays are made, but they do not require force and they do not require aggression. One dog may simply stand over another. Interestingly, more dominant dogs, when there has been a dispute, often engage in more reconciliatory behavior. If you think about it, if you're the individual who normally takes precedence, if you have a fight with an individual, how do you communicate to that individual that you don't want them to leave the group? You know that the group is better with that individual within it, so it's your responsibility to initiate the reconciliation. And that is what happens between dogs. And perhaps, we need to think about how we interact with dogs. It might be that there is a dispute in some situation, and perhaps the owner, after the dispute, and things have settled down, when they come together with their dog, actually by taking the initiative in forgiving the dog and making up to them, they may actually be reinforcing their role as the individual who takes precedence. As I've already indicated, subordinance is often offered preemptively. If you look at two dogs interacting that are unfamiliar, as they try to work out who's going to take precedence, you will see one naturally go very low and duck underneath the other dog's head. It's indicating that I'm quite happy for you to take the lead in this situation, to take precedence, decide what's going on. Leadership and dominance are not the same. So in some situations, leadership and dominance will co-occur. But I hope I've indicated already that they are quite different. Leadership is about coordinating activity. Dominance is about taking precedence. In small groups, where there won't be much division of labour, then both leadership and dominance are likely to overlap. So, for example, an owner with a single dog, then there'll be a lot of overlap between leadership and dominance, or a couple of dogs that are together. Our studies of free-ranging dogs that I've been talking about indicate that another important feature about leadership and why a focus on aggression is not scientifically valid. We actually find that leaders spend a lot of time forming relationships with other dogs. And again, if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. If you're going to lead, you're going to want other people to follow you. So you need a lot of friends. So in these three graphs, what we see is, in effect, a friendship index for between a leader and a follower, the boxes on the left-hand side of the plots, and then the sort of friendship index between two dogs or groups of dogs that are followers. And you can see that the boxes on the right-hand side are lower than the ones on the left, i.e. they have a lower index. The small square in the middle is the median, a form of average of the interactions, and the T bars at either end outside the box indicate the full range. The box itself indicates the range for the middle 50% of the index that is being used. It's also found that the leaders often receive more affiliative submissions in greeting ceremonies, i.e. the followers do tend to offer up a degree of subordinance in that situation. But again, that sort of behavior is not just associated with when there is aggression. It is, and it's not about trying to avert an attack. It is part of normal dog body language. So the leaders spend more time with other dogs, and they do not use aggression in order to assert. Indeed, if a leader were to be very aggressive towards other dogs, you can imagine what would happen when he went off to go hunting, expecting the rest of the pack to follow. They'd probably say, "See you later, we're going to form our own pack without you." So, how does this translate to the home environment? Well, if you think about it, in a typical home environment, owners will naturally take on a range of leadership roles. For example, they typically determine when the dog eats, when the dog has to move at certain times, for example, going for a walk. And so they will build the expectation in the dog that they are the leader in that situation, and the dog is there to follow. So the dog becomes primed to become a follower. That doesn't mean that the dog can't lead in certain activities, and it helps if these other activities are clearly marked. So, for example, in certain forms of agility, the dog will be ahead of the owner, and while the owner may actually do some direction, the dog will often use its initiative if it's familiar with the course. In which case, you might want to suggest that the dog is being the leader. What is really important in these situations is that these activities of who takes on what role are clearly demarcated. There is a consistency, or when there is going to be a change in the role, that it is clearly marked. As I've said, in very small groups, leadership is often general, and so by default, the owner becomes dominant, seem to be dominant because they are the leader in so much of the activity. They will therefore take precedence. Because often the two situations may be occurring together. But this does not involve violence. It does not involve physical punishment or anything like that. Problems can arise, though, when there is inconsistent or unpredictable leadership in certain roles. It is fine, to act in a role where you protect your dog most of the time, and also to ask your dog to protect you, as long as you remember to ask your dog. But if you expect the dog to immediately read your mind or take the initiative in certain situations, unless there are clear cues from the environment, that can be confusing. When you've got confusion in what your role is within a social context, that's when aggressive behavior can actually occur. So we need to think carefully about what form of relationship we want with our dog and how we can build it. Just loving the dog is not enough. We need to think about the roles and think about how we shape those roles, and equally how we tell our dog what we want them to do with regards to our social interactions, and have some consistency there. If you just let your dog run out of the door whenever he wants, and then you try to control it some of the time, you shouldn't be surprised if the dog reacts negatively to that situation, because the dog has built the expectation that he can lead, and when you try to stop, then he's trying to signal that, well, actually, that's not the way that we operate. The rest of the relationship may be fine, but that could result in perhaps an aggressive incident. So just before leaving this topic, I just want to emphasize a few of the popular misperceptions that occur in relation to dominance in dogs. I hope it's clear now that aggression is not necessary to build a social hierarchy in dogs. We do it through being friendly and one dog offering up subordinates to the other in that situation. Dogs control things not by being aggressive. That aggression indicates they don't know who should control the situation. And actually, possession is 9/10 of the law a lot of the time with dogs. So even an individual that is dominant, if it sees another dog has a bone, unless there's a very good reason, the dominant individual will usually leave the other dog with its bone, because it can see the close association. Why provoke conflict unnecessarily? The benefits of living in a social group are so much better than the benefits of being an individual, and that means making certain compromises or allowing those compromises to take place. So if you are a leader, you don't want to provoke others, because that could lead to the disintegration of the group. So proximity to a resource is often an indicator of who can actually control that particular resource. Likewise, sometimes dogs carry things in their stomachs in order to control that particular resource, and this can lead to them eating non-food items as well, because they want to keep control of it. Another common misperception is the idea that dominant individuals monopolize the resources. And again, this is born out of our human way of thinking about power. If you control the resources, you can control people. Dogs' minds don't work like that. Indeed, we know that dogs are actually very sensitive to reward inequality. So if a dog sees that one individual seems to be monopolizing resources, actually they will stop to cooperate, or if they appear even to be unfair in the distribution of resources. So if for similar work, one dog gets 5 treats and another dog gets 1 treat, then the dog that gets 1 treat will stop being cooperative. So actually, being dominant is not about monopolizing resources for yourself. If you did that, you would seem to be being very... the benefits of being with you are greatly reduced, and so the social group will start to break down. So behavior modification programs based on the idea that you monopolize the resources and you limit what the dog can have are not very good for building good, strong social relationships. And it's not what dogs naturally do. The fourth misperception is that dominance is a genetically based trait. Now, when I say that this is a misperception, I don't mean that there is no genetic basis to dominance. However, there is no gene for dominance. If dominance gives you a biological advantage by being able to take precedence over the control of resources, then you would predict that that trait would spread through the group, in which case all the dogs would become dominant. If every dog wants to be dominant, nobody is subordinate, and the whole system breaks down. Now, so there cannot be a single gene for dominance or a cluster of genes for dominance. However, dominance emerges, as I've said, it is an emergent phenomenon. It emerges from a range of both traits, but also a particular environment. There has to be the opportunity to be dominant, as well as you must have the tendency to perhaps exploit certain situations. And so the root of dominance probably lies in a complex relationship between other personality factors coming together with the opportunity to exploit that situation. We shouldn't think that, it's a simple genetic trait. So just to finish off this section, in summary, I hope you can now appreciate that social groups in dogs are based on affectionate bonds. Aggression between in-group members is rare. Dogs spend far more time showing affiliative behavior towards each other. And when there is aggression, that actually indicates a failure of group cohesion and a poor relationship within the group. Secondly, Dominance is established using recognized ritualized actions in order to determine who takes precedence. And this does not involve aggressive behavior. Aggression in this context, again, indicates a failure of effective communication. When we have a clear dominance hierarchy, we actually have a very peaceful group. Everybody knows what their role is, and this emphasizes the importance of encouraging owners to think about what they want their dog to do and making sure it's clearly signaled or cued from the environment. In general, the roles that dogs give to each other emerge from who is best placed to succeed. This requires a degree of consistency and success. Dogs are very astute observers of what works, and they tend to go along with that. So if you're good at something, they will tend to let you do that, and they will follow in that situation. However, if your behavior is very inconsistent, then the dog may feel forced that it has to take a leadership role in that situation, and with that may come certain expectations which can be in conflict with the owner's expectation. As a result, you can develop physical conflict, aggression in those situations. But that is because there is a lack of clarity on who is supposed to do what in a given circumstance. What we mustn't do is overinterpret a dog's intentions. Dogs are living very much in the here and now. They will change their behavior as a result of experience, but they're not sitting there scheming or rationalizing the reasons why something occurs. Our brains are very much designed to think about the causes. Dogs are responding to the situation and trying to produce some consistency in their environment.